Well, welcome to the introduction of this series. I'll begin with a few remarks that I think perhaps will be useful in providing some context as to what will follow in the subsequent sessions. The series has to do with investing in properties, and buying a home, for most of us, I would imagine, is one of the most important decisions that we will make in our lifetime. Consequently, the decision is one that should be considered carefully, especially when using a mortgage, which is simply a financial commitment with very, very strict terms, unbreakable except by death. And I think with that statement, I was inspired to provide a series of lectures, illustrations, sketches, explanations on everything to do with property investing. Now, I know that there are so many books that have been written on property investing. My intention is simply to provide you with some additional context on the subject. And I hope not necessarily to replace what you've learned, but perhaps to support, to enhance the knowledge you already have. Now, like most activities in life, buying a home or buying a property or investing seems very easy. My experience is that it is deceptively hard if and when it's done prudently. And one of the reasons for the difficulty is that the psychological aspects of investing can be difficult to master, especially when you compare that to the analytical or the intellectual aspects of investing. Now, I don't know about you, but for a lot of property buyers, including myself, it can be a challenge to put aside emotions, especially when we find properties that are to our liking, when we find a property that is to our taste, our emotions take over. And at such times, the cautionary steps that we should all take are overlooked in order to make sure that we actually secure the purchase or the property. So in many ways, what you'll find in the series that follow are some ways and some of my methodologies and some of my even heuristics that I use as a way of controlling my emotions. Now, another reason for the difficulty that is associated with managing our emotions and being good investors is that very few property buyers or investors have the technical knowledge or the experience in building design and construction. Although they might have the financial and the capital for the purchase. Now, my intention in the series that follow is to ensure that the likelihood of what I call preventable errors can be minimized, and perhaps to introduce the element of time in your decision-making process so that you do not hurry through your due diligence process for fear that you might miss out on a particular property. There is a saying which I have shared a number of times with both friends and loved ones. The saying is that when a person with experience transacts with a person with money, the one with experience gets the money and the other gets the experience. I would hope that by the end of these series of lectures, that you would never be on the losing side of any property transaction, no matter what. Now, let me start with perhaps the inspiration for this series. In 2020, in December, it was a cold winter afternoon. I stood in my living room and I looked out of the window and I noticed a couple walking down the street. They stopped in front of a building. They faced each other, and then they continued to speak. A few minutes later, a young man arrived who was smartly dressed. They exchanged pleasantries and they all walked into the adjacent building. Now, it was at that time that I noticed a for sale sign by the property. Less than 5 minutes later, they exited the building. They bid each other farewell and they departed. Now, I watched the couple walk away hand in hand, and they did not look at the building. They did not look at the property. Now, I couldn't help but intuit their lack of interest in the exterior of the building that they were, I guess, trying to buy, or they were interested in buying. They had no interest in the adjacencies or even the street. Now, the idea of this conversation was conceived at that point. I started off by sharing a series of sketches, illustrations, as a result of what I observed. But here was what was profound and what inspired me to proceed with capturing my ideas in written form, and firstly in oral form and then in written form. A few weeks later, I stood in the same spot in my living room and I noticed again a young lady arrive. She stopped by the building. She continued her conversation on the phone. A short while later, a sales agent arrived, and just before they walked into the house, I did something different this time. I pulled out my stopwatch because I wanted to get an accurate estimation of how long they would spend inside. Now, as I stood waiting and watching, another young lady arrived. She was also unaccompanied. It appeared at the time that she may have arrived quite early. So she waited outside. She was there to view the same property, and while she waited, I observed her interest in the building, and there wasn't one. She spent most of her time looking at her phone. Finally, the first lady exited the building, and the second lady was ushered into the building by the sales agent. Now, I had my stopwatch. I noted both times. The first lady spent 4 minutes and 40 seconds, and the second lady spent 4 minutes and 13 seconds, respectively, inside the building. Interestingly, both walked away without showing any interest in the building, its exterior, or its surrounding. And that puzzled me. I got puzzled and I couldn't understand. And part of the reason for my surprise was I could not understand how anyone looking to make a significant investment in a building, how they could attend a property viewing, and they showed no interest or little interest in the exterior of the building, its surroundings, its adjacencies. I could not also understand how anyone would spend less than 5 minutes on an inspection of a building, considering that we spend more time in a retail shop when buying a watch, a pair of shoes, or a dress, all of which are less valuable and have fewer consequences if we err in our buying decisions. Now, I should say something that, of course, it is possible that each of the viewers were visiting the property for the second or the third time rather than the first. However, I'm sure you would agree that the probability of all three is slim. Now, my experience as an investor, as someone who's observed, is that most people inspect a property only for a few minutes. This is something I've discussed with both friends who are investors, something I've discussed with sales agents, and in each of the conversations, it became clear that such behaviors were not exceptions, and they were rather common, especially amongst first-time buyers and inexperienced property investors. It was at that point that it dawned on me that this was a problem that was shared by many people and often unknown to them. Yet it was one I believed that I could make a small contribution in solving. So the following day, after observing the two ladies, I sat down and I started to record a free tutorial on property investing. It was a guide to property investing. And I had produced, by the end of the week, I had produced about 15, 30-minute videos, which I uploaded to YouTube. A month after the videos were released, it then occurred to me that we all learn differently, and that it would be useful to provide a written version of my teachings with some additional insights. And so I published the book. The book is called The Ins and Outs of Property Investing. And this series, or this session, is a follow-up to that. And my intention is not to make this series exhaustive. Now, I should also say that they are subjective. A lot of the ideas I will share are subjective. However, they do come from a combination of over 15 years expertise as a chartered engineer in building design and construction, as well as my experience in the last decade in working in finance and investing. So my intention is to provide an insider's guide to investing intelligently in property investing, or in properties. Now, I would say, just before I close, that to invest successfully in properties, you do not need a very high IQ. You do not need great financial or business insights. You do not require any special unique skills. What is needed is a logical framework for making decisions, and the ability to keep your emotions from corroding that framework. Now, I hope that in the sessions to follow, that framework will be obvious. I will provide a framework that I use for investing. I will leave it to you to supply the emotional discipline needed as an investor. Now, I should also state, just like I mentioned in the book, I will say the same thing in these sessions, that I'm not directing this at property speculators or traders. And I am directing this series to property investors. Now, that is a distinction that most people do not appreciate, but one I think you will, and one I will clarify in one of the subsequent sessions. Again, I will also say that these series are not in any way something similar to, how to get rich or how to make £1 million in property investing. Personally, and from my experience, there are no secrets to investing. My focus in teaching is, first of all, to show you how to minimize the odds of suffering irreversible losses, and secondly, how you can maximize your chances of achieving sustainable gains. And if I can, in the process, share some insights as to how you can control what I think is a self-defeating behavior that keeps investors from achieving their vision, which is lack of emotional control, then I think this series would have achieved its purpose. Now, I hope it's been useful, and I'd like to thank you for your time. And in the next session, we'll start with the basics.